Hey y'all, we're getting ready to replace the water pump on this 1991 Ford Ranger. Right now we're draining the system. As soon as that's done, we're going to start pulling some bolts. We've got our tools all laid out here, pretty much everything we're going to need. We're going to have to take off this fan shroud and unbolt the fan from the front of the water pump pulley, which is down here. There's 4 bolts holds the fan on. We're going to loosen the hose for the heater core and the bottom radiator hose there from the water pump. Then we got to take the belt off, and we'll have to loosen the tensioner to do that. But we're going to get into it here in a minute whenever it finishes draining and get started and replace this water pump and get this truck back on the road. Went ahead and started taking some of the bolts off here. So that's shroud, only 2 little bolt holds that on. This is a non-air conditioning truck, so now I've got some of the bolts here loose for the fan. See if I can find a place here for the phone delay for a moment, so that you can see what I'm doing. But sometimes the last bolt's the one that fights you the worst, but you got to expect that. You want to be very careful not to bust the radiator here. Some people pull the radiator out. This one has plenty of room, so we don't have to worry about doing it if we're careful. Anyway, there's the fans coming off. I'm just going to lay that out here, out of the way for the moment. Here's something you run into with factory clamps a lot of times. This is a 91 vehicle, and obviously it's never had a water pump. But these factory clamps rust on, and then they're stapled to the hose from the factory. So oftentimes you have to cut those clamps off. And then you have this style clamp, and the head of the bolt broke off. So that one has to be cut off. You can see the hoses are bulged on the beside the clamps. Somebody has replaced this clamp at one time, but the hose is bulged and it's weak. So we're not going to do that today, but we are going to replace these hoses as well. You know, this vehicle's almost 30 years old. It's definitely due a set of hoses. There you can see we got that hose clamp cut off. Used a Dremel. I mean, that's a handy little tool if you have access to one and you have access to electricity. I want to say something about these hoses though. I said I probably wouldn't replace these today, and the reason behind that is this is my only transportation to work or to town, and I'm basically 30 miles from nowhere. So until I get the water pump on and either a friend drops by or something like that, I don't have a ride to the parts store to get the hoses. So that's why they're not getting replaced immediately. Although if somebody stops by and we get them, we'll have them on here in the video later on today. Now we're going to take this hose off, now we're going to take this belt off. And the reason I left the belt on there is to hold tension on the water pump itself so that I could take those bolts out. Because that'll just free spin without the belt on there, and if it does that, well, you can't put any torque on those belts. But there is ways to get those off using a screwdriver or a small pry bar between this shaft and one of the other bolts. You can hold pressure while you break the others loose. But that's why I left the belt on there. Now to get this bolt off, you have 2 bolts here on the tensioner. You have one right there by my pinky, that's a slide bolt. And then you have the other one that holds the accessories on. If you loosen this one and then loosen this one, then this pulley should slide and create slack so that you can pull the belt off. A lot of vehicles have automatic tensioners that are spring loaded. This one, however, is not spring loaded, and you have to put tension on it whenever you put it back on. And we're going to inspect this belt when we go to put it back together. Just preliminary what I'm seeing right now, it looks okay to use, but we'll look it over better before we put it back together, and if it does need replaced, we're going to go ahead and do it while we're in here. Winter time's coming. Last thing we want to be is stranded alongside the road in the cold. This particular pump has 3 bolts holding it on after you get the hoses off. One is kind of tight up underneath this timing belt cover, and I don't think we're going to have to take that cover off, but if we do, it comes off really easy, and we may have to. But there's only 3 bolts. I mean, it's pretty simple once you get into it to get this off. I didn't have to take the timing cover off, but I thought, shoot, there's only 1 screw and a couple of clips while I'm in here. I just as well have a look at it. I do know that belt was replaced a couple years ago, but still doesn't hurt anything when you're in this deep to go ahead and inspect it. So, we've got the 3 bolts out of the water pump and pulled her off. And you can see right there, that water pump had seen its better days. It was leaking out the weep hole on the bottom. That's what these water pumps do. They're designed to do that when they fail, to start leaking out that weep hole, and it allows you to know that the seal was wore out and the bearing is getting worn and it's time to replace it. Now, one of the things you want to do before you start putting the other one back in is clean all that old gasket material off of there. Get that cleaned up really good. If you don't, you're not going to get a good seal. And if you don't get a good seal, you're going to have to redo this job. The next thing you want to do is you have your new part laying out here. You want to compare it with the old one. I don't know if you can see or not, but this thing is so old. All this is pitted from rust or corrosion, and it's really weak. That's the reason 2 of those prongs was bent, and I could just bend it right back with my finger. But you want to make sure that they're exactly identical. They have all the same inlets and outlets. Now this one here has this extra hole, and that was probably for an air conditioning application or something like that. This one doesn't have it, but this one's sealed off on the inside, or on the outside, so it's not going to hurt anything. That is different. Some applications come in a little bit different. But anyway, there's the new pump. Make sure you get a new gasket. Some kits come with a new gasket. Some kits you have to pay extra for the gasket, so make sure you have that. A little bit of silicone goes a long ways also when you go to put this back together, and possibly a little bit of thread seal, because the bottom bolt on this does go into the water jacket, and if you get a leak at that bottom hole right there around your bolt, guess what? Got to redo it. So we don't like to do things twice. We like to do it once and have it done with. So we're going to make sure all that's right before we put it back together. One more thing you want to check, because some water pumps have different bolt patterns. It might be for the correct engine, but a different style fan, different belt system. So you need to make sure that your pulley, all your bolt holes line up. It'd be awful to get in yonder and get it all put back together and go to bolt this back on and it won't fit. That'd make a bad day. Alright, I've got the gasket surface cleaned up, and I've got the gasket glued up on the new water pump, as you can see there. Now, I'll tell you guys, a lot of people won't tell you this, but all a gasket is a blemish filler. I mean, I don't particularly like silicone in place of a gasket, but it can be used. You can use a cereal box, you know, that your kids eat cereal out of, and you just lay that box down over top of the gasket and just tap it lightly around here with a rubber mallet or a hammer or a wooden handle, and it'll kind of form, and then you can take a pair of scissors and cut it out. I've used those and ran them until the water pumps wore out, fuel pumps, whatever. I mean, all a gasket is a blemish filler. If you have a metal-to-metal surface, it's not going to be exactly smooth and exactly, flush mount, so it's going to leak, and that's all that does is fills in the gaps. That's it. There's a lot of different ways you can glue these gaskets on. You don't need to use glue. It just makes assembly a lot easier. If you don't glue it on, then you have to fight it on there trying to get your bolt started in. Just a little bit easier to glue it on, and there's several different things. There's gasket glues. I've seen people use a little bit of spray paint and hit the gasket and immediately stick it on there. I mean, I've seen all kinds of things. An old timer taught me one time years ago, probably before silicone was a big thing. He used string or dental floss, and he would just simply thread it through the hole, tighten the knot, thread it through the hole, tighten the knot, thread it through the hole, and tighten the knot. And would hold the gasket in place, and when you put it on, bolt it up, the gasket would absorb the fine string that you use. You know, like say dental floss is real thin, so is thread, and that's the way I was taught years ago to hold a gasket like that on. So there's a lot of different options that you can do that with, and I just used a clear gasket glue, and I'm not going to, you know, throw out name brands or anything like that. You guys can use whatever name brands you want to, but it doesn't take much to hold it in place. It's already stuck, and I'm ready to reassemble. But just want to give you a heads up on some of the things that you can do in place of silicone, or in place of a gasket if you're out in the boonies like I am, and didn't happen to get a gasket, or you messed the gasket up. You know, you can use a cereal box and a number of other things. A lot of people even keep sheets of gasket maker in their toolbox, so you can cut one out of a sheet of a gasket material. So it just gives you some of your options, and I'm going to go ahead and start to reassemble this now. What I like to do, I like to snug everything up hand tight. I do have air tools and power tools, y'all, but to be honest with you, I just like my hand tools. It's almost as fast and it's quieter and gives me time to think. But anyway, I like to snug them all up hand tight, make sure everything fits good. And something I forgot to tell you earlier, when you take these bolts out, lay them in order to the order they came out. If you start with this bolt and this one, lay them in that order up here on the battery box or your tray, tool tray, whatever. Because a lot of times these water pump bolts are in different lengths on different vehicles. So you know, you don't want to put a bolt that's too long in one hole, or one that's too short in one hole. You wouldn't think too short would make a difference, but on a lot of V8 motors, especially on Fords, the water pump bolts also holds the timing cover on, so it goes through the water pump, through the timing cover, into the block. So if you use a bolt too short there, then you're going to spring a leak in the back, and again, you're going to have to take it all back apart. But just make sure you lay everything out. You know, if you've never done it before, it's an easy job, it really is. Just lay everything out in order so that when you go to put it back, you put it back in the reverse order. You know, it's no big deal. But anyway, I've got those snugged up, and I'm going to go ahead and tighten them down. And then we'll put the timing cover back on and start reassembling this. Alright, I've got the water pump tightened up. I've got the hoses back on. Put the new clamp on it there. I'll keep a stock of those. And the belt just on here loose. It hasn't been tensioned up yet. And I still have to torque down the fan bolts. One thing you don't want to forget to do is put your drain back in. If you leave that out, you'll go to add your coolant, and your coolant will be on the ground. So when you go to tighten everything up, don't over tighten. These little bolts will twist off and break really easy. Look in your book for your particular vehicle, or Google it online, find out what your torque specs are. That way you don't over tighten anything and break it down. A lot of vehicles has a torque sequence also for certain things. It keeps the metal from warping, especially aluminum parts. But I'm going to go ahead and tighten this fan down and tighten the belt down, and then we'll put our shroud back on and we'll be ready to add coolant. Something else I was telling you all earlier, that if you did unhook the belt first and you needed to break these bolts loose and you needed to hold this from free spinning, that you could use a tool, a screwdriver or a tool. And this is not a very good angle here, y'all. I'm doing the best I can with two hands, but if you need to tighten that bolt down, you can take a screwdriver and you can stick it between the bolt below and the water pump shaft itself, and you can push down on the screwdriver and down on the wrench and tighten that bolt up. And the same would go if you were going to loosen the bolt. You would do the same thing, and you'd put the screwdriver on this side and weasel it in there, and put your wrench on this side and push down on both of them and break the bolt loose, and that'll keep the pulley from turning. Just little tricks that you pick up along the way, y'all. So there it is. It's all back together. Topped it off with a 50-50 mix, and I will have to drain the system back out again because I didn't think far enough ahead to get new hoses. I mean, these hoses are good, but you know, how long is it until 30-year-old hose gives out? So I should have had the foresight when I bought the pump to go ahead and buy the hoses and replace them, but I didn't. So now I've got extra work on myself. But you can see there, it just didn't take very long at all to change the water pump on it. It's pretty simple and straightforward on this particular model. Some of them are more difficult, some of them are even easier. But gives you an idea on a Ranger 2.3 what you're looking at anyhow. Thanks for watching.